Proper trim is essential for any diver, but especially for the mobility impaired diver. The able-bodied diver who's got poor trim can always kick himself into a prone position in order to move smoothly through the water. However, for a paraplegic, it's already difficult to propel yourself when you are only using your arms, when you don't have powerful fins to move you through the water. So it's very critical that you be in a very hydrodynamic position where it's going to be easy to slice through the water. And if you're swimming for somebody else, it's just as important that they be well trimmed, because if they're not well trimmed, you're going to kill yourself. It's going to be like trying to push a fridge right through the water. Or you could try to hold them in a trimmed position, but you're going to be working really, really hard to do this if they don't fall naturally into a trimmed position. There's another reason why keeping a proper trim is very important. When you're diving, if you're in a position like this, you're not in tune with your environment. It's hard for you to control your buoyancy. A key element of buoyancy control is having good visual reference. However, if you're keeping a good trim in the water, if your students are keeping a good trim in the water, they're in tune with their environment. They know how far they are off the bottom, so they can judge if they need to exhale and go down a little bit, or inhale and go up a little bit. There are two forces that act upon a diver underwater. There's buoyancy and gravity. Both these forces have a focal point. We call them the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy. A sailboat has those two forces acting upon it. The center of buoyancy is probably somewhere here on this sailboat, but they've intentionally put a heavy keel under it to lower the center of gravity. The distance between the center of buoyancy and the center of gravity is called the righting arm. The greater that distance is, the stiffer the boat will be. What we mean by stiff is we mean it will have a tendency to not want to tilt over, and if it does tilt over, it's going to have a tendency to want to right itself up. That's why the term is righting arm. That being said, on a diver, we want to have pretty much the exact same thing. When a disabled diver is in the water, if he has any weight in the back, he's going to have a tendency to list and doesn't have a finning action. When we fin, we right ourselves up automatically. So that's why we try to never have any weights in the back. We try to avoid steel tanks, and we try to put the weight as far forward as possible. We want our diver to be leveled on the sagittal plane. We don't want him to list. And the way we can accomplish this is if we're using a weight belt, we'll put all the weights at the front, or preferably if we're using integrated weights, we'll pick an integrated weight pocket that does not have the weight pockets on the side. That allows us to put the weight as far forward as possible. We just saw that our sailboat was designed to be stiff along the sagittal plane. What this means is that if it tilts over, it will aggressively right itself. And that's because its righting arm is quite long. There's quite a big distance between the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy. However, this same sailboat on the other axis is designed to be tender, which means that the center of gravity and the center of buoyancy are pretty close to each other. This way, when the boat hits a wave, it'll pitch up, and when it comes back down, it will let itself down. We want our diver to be exactly the same. And when we put a weight belt around the hips of a diver, we're doing the opposite. Our diver here with the weight belt on has got his center of gravity around his hips. His center of buoyancy is way up here where his lungs are. And that being said, if the diver relaxes in the water, he will always stay in this position. So for the mobility impaired diver, we want to try to shift weight up on the diver. And what this will accomplish is a good diving position like this. This is a position in which a paraplegic will have no problem swimming because he will be hydrodynamic and he's not going to have any resistance. And it's just as good for a mobility impaired diver who can't swim, because you're not going to struggle to move him along the water column. It's going to be easy. And the way that we've achieved this was by moving the weights up closer to his center of buoyancy, which is his lungs. And there's going to be another advantage to this. If his center of gravity is close to his center of buoyancy, not only is he going to sit in this position, but if he wants to straighten himself up, just a minor little effort will take him up. And if he wants to come back down, just a minor little effort will take him back down. Knowing what we've just learned, it would seem pretty obvious where to put the weights on a diver. But your center of buoyancy actually changes throughout a dive. There's a few factors contributing to that. One of them is how deep you are, how much air you have in your tank, and also how you're breathing. As you can see, our diver is quite vertically trimmed here. In order to get more horizontally trimmed, he's going to tighten his shoulder straps, which is going to lift his integrated weights up, shifting his center of gravity upwards, which makes him more horizontally trimmed. If his center of buoyancy changes throughout the dive, like if his tank becomes lighter or he becomes a little bit nervous and is breathing harder, in order to get a little less horizontally trimmed, he can loosen his shoulder straps, pull his weights down as he's doing right now, and that'll make him more vertical. He can also use this to do more comfortable descents and ascents. This being said though, we normally do put weights on people's knees, but just enough for the legs to come down like this, and then the other part of the leg to float up. And what happens is that the weights at the knees kind of act like a pivot point on the diver that help him stabilize himself. Now, we never want to put enough weight at the knees that we completely throw off the person's trim. So just enough to trim him down. You basically have a choice. You're either going to put an amount of weight at the knee that will trim your diver well underwater, or put a lot of weight at the knee which is going to make surface balance easy. I always shoot for my divers to be well trimmed underwater, and then what we do is we end up spending a lot of time on surface skills, teaching them the 3 basic surface skills that they need to know to initiate a good descent. And if you spend enough time, they'll be able to initiate a good descent without throwing a lot of weight at the problem around the knees. Some people like to put weight at the ankles. That works sometime, but very often it's a problem, because what happens is if I put the weights at the ankles, the legs are going to go down like this, and then the feet get hooked on things, and the diver has a tendency to pivot a lot more because the weight is further from his center of gravity. However, if you're diving with divers that have cerebral palsy and their legs are stiff, then it may be a good thing to put weights at the ankle, because the legs will not have a tendency to come down and get hooked on things like the legs of a paraplegic or a quadriplegic would.